Chapter 22 of This Finer Shadow by Harlan C. McIntosh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was uncomfortably warm in the room where Martin was working on his type. He tried it a while longer, then put aside his papers and went to the roof. There were two women lying on a blanket taking a sun bath. They were in bathing suits and had the straps pulled down over their shoulders. Martin had to pass them to get to the opposite side of the porch, so he excused himself and only glanced at them briefly, but his presence apparently irritated them. One of the women, dark-haired and older than the other, seemed particularly annoyed. She laid her hand on the younger girl's arm and whispered something audibly and caustically to her friend. The remark was in such bad taste that Martin turned around and surveyed them coolly. A dog was lying on the blanket with the women. He was little and white. He was young and curious and friendly. He trotted over to Martin, observed his white slacks, then looked back at his own coat. He sniffed at the slacks and raised his head, and all the while Martin stood quietly and looked at him. The dog's eyes were brown. His legs were sturdy. Martin wanted to put his hand on the little head. He had done it before with animals. It was a sort of blessing. He wanted to say, "I like you. Don't let yourself be destroyed by these people." But he did not move. The women would object. They would speak sharply, and the puppy would be ashamed. Blood filled Martin's head. He had worked late the night before, and he was tired. Anger shook his mind. Once more he looked across the roof at the women. Then he knelt to the dog. Holding the nervous head between his hands, he watched the brown eyes. In his own was reflected an heroic poem, an attainable star. Martin did not beg, nor did he demand. He showed the small one something greater than pettings and soft food. He showed him hard winds, ice and sun, his wolf-like ancestors, their smoky, torn fur. The dog became quiet, watching intently. He made no sound. Martin held him patiently, listening with him to the soft pad of feet on the leaves above and around them. The dog's brown eyes grew wider, older, and became lost. Martin stood up and regarded the women, thinking, symbols of a denatured civilization. Men linked together are strung, it is true, on the rock of a fool's evolution. But in them tragedy, strength, and beauty neutralize the distortion. While across from me on the roof groped the clowns, the mimics playing music they can never understand. The chords they touch turn black. The older woman called the dog to her. She put her arm around him and called him Willie. It was not the word, it was her eyes and her mouth and the way her hands worked. It is an indictment of womanhood, thought Martin. The woman looked at him, and seeing him stand so cold and full of hatred, she held the dog tighter. She held his fur and his body tighter, but Willie had gone. He was standing by a campfire. His hair was singed, and there was a red line across his shoulders. His eyes were tired and glad with dreams. Every woman feels biological change. It is her first lesson and her last. Although she often misinterprets her intuitive strength, she possesses it. This woman looked at Willie. She could not smell the singed hair nor see the red line, but she did see his eyes. A sadness, a real sorrow was in her. She turned from the dog to Martin, who stood contemptuous and erect, and she turned away. "Now am I right?" Martin asked himself, observing, in spite of his anger, this dark woman's passion to condemn the ovary that cries out for its sister, and absolve by ritual the formulated counterpart in man. He stood there pondering in this procession of new thought. And am I wrong that I can't feel the love that topples ethics, puts wire in soft fingers with one breath? Why can't I feel the music of one breast upon another? And why do I call such music black, when I might taste much softer lips than mine upon much softer lips? These dismal cries, two sheer stockings ripped from their garters, and one frightened voice saying, "God, make it straight with me," while the other frantically tries syntheses and fluctuating pose. Martin watched the slender clouds beyond the black roofs for a moment, and then went below. Martin was drowsing on the couch in his room when there was a rap at the door, which he had left open. He glanced up sleepily. Roberts was standing there, an attempted smile only accentuating his moroseness. "Come on in," said Martin, cordially, sitting up. "Have a chair. That one's the most comfortable." He pointed to the rocker. "Damn comfort," replied Roberts, nevertheless sitting down. He was thinner. There was an harassed expression on his face which Martin had never seen before. "I dare say you're surprised at my coming here," he continued. "No," said Martin, frankly good-humoured, "and I'm glad to see you." The adviser waved the words away. "Don't be social, in heaven's name. It isn't in your make-up. And if you're not surprised, I am, considering the attitude you've taken toward me lately." Martin laughed, stood up and stretched, and offered him a cigarette. "Don't be a damn grouch, Roberts. You never got an attitude you didn't ask for. Light up, and I'll show you some work I'm doing. It's too hot to fight." "Stop talking like a hussy," said the adviser as he took the cigarette. His face was damp and his hand was shaking. Martin half closed his eyes, and there was a curious line about his mouth. Then he laughed again and held out a lighted match. "What's so amusing?" asked Roberts, holding his hand against his cheeks, which seemed to be burning. "Is it this squalor you're living in, or is it I?" "You're steeped in sin, Martin, but this is the first time I've felt the flatness of hypocrisy." There lay his mistake. He'd struck a heel softer than he knew, for with every flaw Martin had, he hated the word just spoken the most. His entire appearance changed, and his cheeks became as white as Robert's were red. "Are you here as a friend?" he asked. The changed timbre of Martin's voice seemed to stabilize Roberts. "As a friend." The adviser was serious. "I've something that should interest you vitally." He regarded Martin, who still seemed unresponsive. "Don't underestimate this," Roberts continued severely. "I happen to know that Carroll is following you." He waited intently for the effect of this speech upon his listener. "I suspected as much," answered Martin. "In fact, I found him at it one night and asked him up." "What?" cried Roberts, shocked, amazed, with every thread of jealousy burning in his face. "Good God, Martin, the man's dangerous. I know him better than you do. He's pathological. He'll stop at nothing. And you permitted him. You saw him here alone?" "Yes," said Martin dryly, all alone." Robert stood up, propped his stick in a corner, and walked the length of the room. His head was lowered. He was absorbed, as if debating with himself. At last he turned swiftly. "You don't want to die, do you?" he asked, staring. "No." "Then watch out." "For what?" "For that kind of impudence which incurs my displeasure." Martin leaned back against the head of the couch, put his chin on his hands, and looked solemnly at his visitor. "Have you lost your mind?" he asked. Robert's mouth opened and shut as though he were in rarefied air. Then he sat down again and looked at his hand, which was still shaking. "Martin," he whispered, "I'm frightened." "I'm not astonished at that." Martin sat up. "Roberts," he cried earnestly, "it's imperative that you get your thoughts out of this channel." "There is no other channel," interrupted the adviser. "I'm humiliated, degraded, but there is no other channel." "Very well," said Martin. "I won't try to persuade you to think differently then, but I do ask you to give me the real purpose of this call." "I came to warn you." "Against Carroll or yourself?" Roberts did not answer. His face was set, and all the colour had drained out of it. Martin observed him closely. "You've had some bad nights, my friend." The adviser wiped his forehead. "Yes, bad nights. That I should live for this." He looked about him wildly. Martin sat up straighter. "Overlook thee this, my mad companion, and look for that." Robert stared at him with amazement rising to horror. "Destroyer of words," he said. "My God, you destroyer of sand and clay and rock that make the brilliant hills." "Yes, destroyer." Martin nodded in agreement. Roberts got up, holding unsteadily to the arm of the chair. "I'll leave you to your destiny," he cried with savage vehemence. "Unless it's interwoven," answered Martin coldly. The adviser's eyes grew bright as though with fever. "Again your hatred and your words." Martin nodded once more. "That's right." What will you do if I don't permit you?" Robert stopped. "Propose something," commanded Martin, rising. "I do." The adviser picked up his stick and walked uncertainly toward the door. As he turned, he seemed to be smiling. "I have proposed something." With an easy stride Martin went to him. He took the stick from his hand and placed it against the wall. He reached for the door and closed it. Deliberately he caught Roberts by the waist and bent him backwards until he fell. Then he poured one bitter kiss after another, his teeth cutting the adviser's tender lips and cheeks, his sweat falling like molecules of light. Robert screamed and turned his face away. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of This Finer Shadow by Harlan C. McIntosh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. One quiet evening, Dean and Martin walked down to a street exhibit in the village. Since Robert's visit to Martin, Dean had felt a melancholy restlessness about the man she loved, and on this evening, with small stationary clouds in the west prolonging the summer twilight, she tried with careful intrigue to bring him back again. They walked the long way, past odd forsaken streets, past streets with checkered foreign signs, past junk shops, curio shops, past streets where old furniture, silverware, and books were on display within the dusty, ill-kept windows, past lending libraries, past a little half-street with quiet, mysterious houses, past streets that wandered helplessly about until, faced with some busy thoroughfare, they paused abruptly, bewildered, and of necessity came to their end. There was one street built like a dagger, with a single row of trees across it for its hilt. There were crooked streets, dirty streets, smart streets, streets attempting to be gay and failing miserably, streets falling over themselves, scrambled streets, streets running pell-mell at last into Greenwich Square. The exhibit centered around 8th Street and meandered, after various aimless shambles, along McDougal Street and into the somewhat limited security of McDougal Alley. Countless easels which held oils or studies in crayon, finished or unfinished, were scattered about the sidewalks. Odd bits of craftsmanship hung on the walls of buildings or were placed for sale on the curbs. Caricaturists and cut-out artists in their batik smocks were hawking their talents to the crowd, not with the loud raucous voices of sideshow barkers at a fair, but with proud and careful gestures and an occasional remark about art in general, which most of the crowd took seriously. At the end of McDougal Alley, a hard, slim man who looked like Popeye was daubing wildly at his canvas. Martin grinned and pulled Dean back by her elbow, stopping her suddenly. "Look at that old boy," he said under his breath, all his melancholy abstraction leaving him in an instant. "He's mad as a hatter, and dreaming of a Dutch ship he took one time out of Sumatra. See, honey?" Martin grew more excited, and pointing to the painting, "She's built like a sabot, equally stable in the North Sea or the South Pacific." The Hollanders knew how. He nodded wisely. "By God, I've a little of their blood in my own veins," he continued with pride. "The painting's bad, but the thing's there all right. The man has memories." He jigged Dean's arm again. "I'm going to tell the old chap I'm a steamship man. Watch him blow up. He never sailed under anything but canvas." Dean grew concerned. "Don't make him angry, Martin," she said, holding back. "I won't. Come on, darling." And pulling her after him, he walked up casually behind the old seaman. "Ah," said Martin, as though speaking to Dean, "there's a fine ship." "Ye don't know her stem from her stern," said the painter, turning round to observe the speaker, then dabbing a ferocious spot of sea under his ship's bow. "She's beautiful," insisted Martin. "That is, she would be if she had just a touch of steam." He paused for a second. "There's nothing like steam in a calm, or if you need a head in the wind." The brush dropped out of the painter's hand, and his face turned the colour of brick. "Steam!" he snorted. "Ay, when round the Horn, with just me hat spread, boy. He picked up his brush, wiped it carefully, and jabbed at the canvas again. "I took me own ship round the Cape durin' a gale. There was less time than you'll get in your liner, and it gave me a belly at 50 you'll never see at 30." Martin nodded. "Canvas had its points all right," he agreed. "Steam," repeated the old master scornfully, not in the least mollified, and spat upon the ground. "Well," persisted Martin, "I wish I could have tried your square riggers. I never quite trusted steam myself." His voice sounded a little regretful. The old master looked at him, suspicion in his eyes. Suddenly he stepped nearer and brought his face up close to Martin's. "Do you know where the Scylla deeps be?" he asked mysteriously. "A sea no sailor has found, sir," answered Martin. The old master continued to peer at him with mistrust. "Where did me best rope hang, boy?" "From the yardarm, sir." Martin gave him a slow smile. "And it's not all that hung from there, sir," he added knowingly. The master's face turned into a series of amused lines and crevices. He grabbed Martin's arm, and his white lips puckered into laughter. "If I could have had ye as cabin boy, me lad, ye might have been made a sailor. But no more steamship gab," he warned, shaking his finger. He turned once more to the painting. "Now ain't she a beauty?" He pointed with pride to the ship, and over his ravaged face came a sorrowful and faraway expression. "She was trim as a herring," he said, so low they could scarcely hear. "Trim as a herring, me boy." Martin spoke soberly, with an infinite respect. "She was, sir, and she is. I'm glad you're bringing her alive." The old master stared at him. His eyes seemed flaked with salt, and he brushed one rough hand across them. Martin took Deane's arm once more. "Good-bye, sir. A good trip, sir," he said, pulling Deane along. But the old master just kept staring as the two walked away. "Why did he look like that?" Deane whispered, her own eyes full of tears. "That ship went down, honey, and the master also," answered Martin. On the next corner, standing in an erect, unnatural posture, was a man with a full red beard. In one hand the man held a comb, which occasionally he used on his chin, with a gesture at once contemptuous and desperate. In the other hand there was a ragged paper upon which something was written, and this he wore as though it were a part of him. When any passed too close he would draw back the manuscript, hastily covering the words, the beer stains, and perhaps tears with his palm. His bold chin under its red blanket would jut angrily. He would hunch his shoulders, and his eyes, which were a little blurred, would narrow in agony and hatred. Martin, ashamed for all mankind that it had shamed this artist and his work, walked by with an impassive glance, understanding full well the torment of beauty which must be held within itself. But the man, sensing some kinship within Martin, or feeling some belligerent contempt, held out to him the sheaf of paper containing all the golden words born of himself in adoration, hunger, and distrust. His speech was rapid, barely articulate. 25 cents, sir," he called out mockingly. "A block of my heart for 25 cents." Deane pressed against Martin, and he knew that she was frightened. He tried, without speaking, to tell her not to be, and walked on with a strolling deliberation, eyes ahead without expression, minimizing as far as possible the high chain of laughter behind them. He visualized the rotten teeth, the long hysteria. And then they came upon a flower man, a small Sicilian with an olive skin and a charming, wistful face. He was standing by his little cart, his hands down by his side as though in a mild passion, with his lot among the flowers. There were cornflowers and mignonette, crisp French marigolds and early cosmos. Deane made her choice. "Buy me the marigolds," she asked of Martin. "You remember, they were your first gift to me." The little olive gentleman bowed and smiled, and carefully selecting the freshest marigolds from his stock, twisted a strip of tinfoil around their stems before handing them to Deane. Shortly after they left him, Deane looked back. He was standing by his little cart, still smiling, his hands down by his side in gentle obsequiousness. Touched deeply by this profound and infinite patience, Deane thought of all the things she had seen that day. One man with a phantom ship, one with a poem, and one she glanced sideways at Martin, and suddenly, unnoticed by him, the tiny bunch of marigolds which she was clutching fell from her grasp. Later, in the soft candlelight within the apartment, Martin sat on the arm of Dean's chair, quietly twisting the ring upon his finger. The small red stone on its field of black looked at him speculatively. The tender perception which had been Dean's all that evening now gave way to a definite and fearful prescience. "What is it, darling?" she asked, for Martin had not spoken in some time. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too. But what disturbs you, Martin?" He avoided her eyes. "It was only a dream," he said at last, "but it has worried me. I dreamt I died and found myself at the crossroads of heaven and hell, there to make my decision as to which path I should walk." "What? A dream? Worry you?" Dean sighed with relief and ran her hand across his cheek. Then she arose and led him to the divan. One by one the candles had gone out, and like a spectre the pallid light of the full summer moon crept into the apartment. "Go on, my darling," she whispered, half closing her eyes and stretching luxuriously against him. "I died," he repeated, "and I found myself at the crossroads of heaven and hell. I was undecided as to which road to take. Then suddenly I knew the answer. I knew they diverged only for a time." "What do you mean?" In Dean's voice was a note of dismay. "I knew that whichever road I took, it would end in pain." "Oh, no." "Yes, I knew that the end would be the same. So impudently I took the road marked heaven. I walked for days among winding mountain paths. Giant trees sang to me in the wind, and the air was fragrant with pine and wild rose. Little creeks ran past me, twisting over mossy rocks, and there were narrow falls of water spinning white and silver. In shadowy places where the water eddied, dark green and gold, I stopped to rest and drink. A long time I walked through this country. By day the sun struck blindly through the limbs of trees, and at night a moon showed. Then I came to a valley where I saw broad fields of grain, shining yellow, and checkerboards of green pasture and plowed field. I was confused by the intermittent sound of bells which rang through the air. On one block of green pasture there was a great multitude. I went down the trail, leaving the forest behind, and descended into the lowland. As I approached the congregation, I saw to my amazement that they were all children. I wondered at their quietness. They were so silent and unmoving that I would have thought them dead had it not been that they were facing me, a sweet, desperate expression on their faces. The macabre quality in these little ones gave me an unpleasant thrill. No murmur sounded from this congress of children, no movement of arm, knee, or head. Full of a presentiment of evil, I walked closer and looked down into their eyes. Row after row of these spectral organisms were before me, reaching, it seemed, to the horizon. Thousands of bright curly heads shone faintly in the haze of the sun. Their wide eyes, blue or brown, were directed at me. My mouth was hot. I tried to smile. "Have I reached heaven?" I asked them. The answer seemed to be projected from 1,000 throats, but it reached my ears as a whisper. This tired wind blowing so held only compassion. It was unbearable, and it said, "We love you." Martin's face became severe and rigid as he told this. "Go on, Martin," Dean urged. "I can't. It was a dream, Martin. Finish the dream." "It was destiny," he cried. "I murdered 10,000 innocents. I asked them if I was in heaven, and they answered that they loved me. To wheedle, to coax a smile into their weakening, passive faces, I asked a question. They told me that they loved me." Martin repeated tiredly, and once more Dean felt a prescience of terror. "I wanted to raise my hand," Martin went on. "I wanted to shout, to jump into the air, to sing a song, anything to dissipate the irrevocable impression of death that carved each face into the appearance of a dying flower. I was desperate, and I felt that I was wrong. 'Children,' I said, 'I've hurt you. Tell me the poison, the action, or the mood that has brought you this pain.' I can't explain how they looked. It wasn't sadness, nor was it condemnation. It was a death's joke, and I was horrified. Again the wind of their minds moved restlessly in my ears. Pain you prophesied, it said. It was a prophecy of pain for myself, I told them. I didn't mean to condemn you. This time, said Martin, there was no answer, no audible answer, but for the first time the children moved, dropping gently on their knees. They lowered their eyelids, accentuating the pallor of their faces. I cried out to them. I begged their forgiveness. I cursed myself, tore open my shirt and looked for a weapon, reasoning that my death would bring life to the children. As Martin said this, he caught his breath and projected a swift pain into the woman. Dean held him gladly, drawing in his venom, half fainting. But Martin, pressing deeper into his mind, continued furiously. At each of my gestures, at each syllable, the children sank closer to the grass. Their eyes closed with precision until only the fringe of lash showed where the eyes had been. Watching the slow death of thousands, I stopped speaking and stood rigid, my jaws locked. I glared at them. I saw each movement become fainter until each tortured flower face lay on the ground, their chins propped up to me. Their cheeks were like wilted petals. Their white, reedy arms were extended above them, and each child finger was pointed toward me. Martin stopped speaking. Dean lay quiet within his arms. She felt his face against her throat, felt her own arms pinioned, and her agony intensified. Compassionately, she kissed the thick perspiration from his forehead. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of This Finer Shadow by Harlan C. McIntosh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Martin pushed his chair away from the linotype, waiting for copy. He leaned back and spoke to Rio, who was sitting on the window sill behind him. Smell that sulfur? Yeah. It's from the plant across the way. Gets sweet about this time every night. You've probably noticed it before. It don't make no difference, said Rio. This is one hell of a place, any way you look at it. Noise and dirt. He spat out the window. Martin yawned and stretched in his chair, but made no answer. It ain't no place for me, continued Rio grimly. Some of the boys look restless. Is it the strike you're worrying about? The strike may not come off, Rio. There's always a lot of talk, and if it does, it's no worse than the waterfront. Well, anyway, I'm going out for a smoke. Rio walked into the little hallway, calling back over the banisters to Martin to find out how much longer he had to wait. Martin glanced at his watch. I'll be through in 20 minutes, he said. We can stop down the street for a nightcap. I'll be outside, Rio mumbled, and went on down the stairs. He was sitting on the steps when Martin joined him. His huge frame filled the doorway, and as he arose lazily, Martin wondered, as he had wondered many times before, at the harmony of his movements. Far beyond the reaches of the sulphur fumes, the soft tread of these men, accustomed as they were to the intricate woven fabric of the sea, made scarcely a sound in the night. Rio sniffed. New York, he said as they walked along, it smells different this time of year. And Martin, through his friend, felt a definite new motion in the color of the air, a deliberate music brought by the full season. In both retrospect and in the moment, Martin watched Huysmans, that frightened older brother, break the skyline into small patches of dim lights between the darkened buildings. So still was the atmosphere that the two friends felt annoyed at the sight of a lighted tavern, but they stopped in for a drink nevertheless, then went on slowly toward Martin's rooming house. Say, Martin, said Rio finally, I've been thinking over that act you pulled with Roberts. I don't get it. He laughed. It's funny, though. It really wasn't an act, replied Martin. Rio looked at him through the darkness. You mean? Good Lord, no, interrupted Martin. I'll admit it's difficult to understand even for me. But the way he stood, the way he smiled, and his new threat, remember he's carried them out before, made me break loose. I kept thinking as I looked at him, that he'd always ask me for something that he didn't want. When I called him, I must have known he wasn't real, for when I pretended a consummation, he was frightened and ashamed." Rio shook his head. "You're a brave lad. It makes me sick to think about it." Martin's tone was peculiar. "I was poisonous," he said. Rio looked at him again and shrugged his shoulders. "Well, I guess it cured him." Martin thought a moment. "I don't know. I suppose that when it comes down to it, I don't understand him at all. By the way, Rio, what made him take such a dislike to you?" "Nothing much. I asked him about you once, and when I found out he lied, I shook him up." Rio closed his fist in the dark. "I wish I'd shook him harder now," he added, half under his breath. "Damn it, that's the payoff," said Martin angrily. Rio turned to him. "If you mean you're fed up messin' with this queer outfit, I'm with you." He began to walk more rapidly. "I wish to God I was back." Martin interrupted. "I know. Sometimes I wish we were at sea again." "What about Dean?" asked Rio. Martin's voice was as even as his steps. "I wouldn't mention her name, Rio," he said. "We never think about a little thing like that the first time." His voice was trembling now. "But I wouldn't ever see her or mention her name again." They walked along 8th Street without speaking for a few blocks until Rio turned to his friend. "Is that all you're going to say?" he asked. "Yes." "I'm a miserable bastard, Martin. I wish I was in Santa de Marina. By God, I think I'll go." Rio sounded so unusually plaintive that Martin had to laugh. "I don't blame you. Why don't you return to the family? Your money won't last them forever, and you could make out all right down there." They had reached Washington Square and were about to turn down Martin Street when Rio stopped him. "Let's go in and sit down for a while, buddy. There's a few things I'd like to ask you." Martin walked beside him until they came to the large circular rim of the fountain. They sat down on the low concrete wall, and Rio put out his cigarette, grinding it under his heel on the pavement. It seemed difficult for him to speak. "You know," he said finally, "I've been around more than most men. I've been places and seen funny practices and ugly ones among the heathen. And I know Berlin better 'n I do New York. The same goes for a few other cities. I thought I'd scraped most people and most happenin's. Then I had the luck of bumpin' into you." "Good or bad?" asked Martin. "Bad, I guess, or I'd have missed it." "Why bad?" "Well, because I had a few ideas that I believed in. Somehow you've managed to mess them up." "That's all right," said Martin, emphasizing his words with a quick movement of his hand. "If you were on a weak foundation, you shouldn't mind having your opinions reversed. If you had a strong one, I couldn't change it." "It ain't one or the other," said Rio in disgust. "You can take an idea, right or wrong, and squeeze it like butter." His tone grew deeper, and Martin felt that he was frowning in the semi-darkness. "I'm going to ask you a question, Martin. Don't get sore, and I don't mean it hard. But I got to know. We've kidded each other a lot since we met. You stood by me." Rio's voice faltered. He swallowed and stopped for a moment. Martin could hear his heavy breathing. "Get rid of it, Rio," he said. "It's goddamned crazy," said Rio, swearing to hide his embarrassment. "But listen, Martin, are you—" Martin half closed his eyes. "Oh," he thought. He watched his friend struggling through this viscous medium in a painful attempt to absorb most of its ugliness himself. But he gave the man no clue, no help. He merely closed his eyes tighter and listened. "Are you," continued Rio, then his voice stronger and more demanding, "are you a goddamn fairy with your goddamned eyes and the way you look at people? You look queer in that draggy dress at the party, and you acted queer." Rio hesitated. "Oh, I know you took care of me afterward, but when I seen you leanin' on the piano like a girl, I went crazy. If you're a queen, tell me." His voice had become so husky that he could scarcely speak. "And if you ain't, what are you? Let me know. Let me know damn fast." He was breathing still harder, and Martin could hear his hands rubbing against the concrete. He slipped off the side of the fountain and faced Rio. In the quiet night, without a moon, the open stars drew their icy shine across his eyes. He lit a cigarette, and in the brief flare Rio could see the drawn lips, the contemptuous silhouette, and the sharp lines in his face. "Time doesn't count, Rio. Kindly don't be in a hurry." Martin spoke softly. "And remember, I'm talking about myself and not you, so don't be anxious. You've asked me a question in your manner, and I'll answer it in your manner, Rio. I am." "Damn you, you're not," Rio cried out. "Then it's for you to judge." "I don't judge nothin', Martin," said Rio, standing and facing him. "But if you ain't, why do you hang around them?" "Them?" asked Martin with a bleak smile. "If you could see yourself standing there, frightened of yourself, frightened of me, frightened of symbols." "I tell you I'm not like that," interrupted Rio, his hands back of him. "Perhaps you are," said Martin quietly. "Clear that up." Rio was leaning slightly forward in dignified yet dangerously immobile restraint. "Clear that up fast." Martin spoke earnestly, without resentment. "Before you ever ask another man that question, Rio, go to the mirror and ask it of yourself. Perhaps the answer will be, 'Thou too.'" Rio kept the same tense attitude. "You mean I am?" he asked slowly. "You better explain it well this time. Show me your point." Martin looked at him indifferently. "You asked me, didn't you, if I was queer? And although you're deathly afraid of it yourself, you hold such people in contempt. Did you think I was going to deny it, as though it were intrinsically a shameful thing?" "You say it ain't shameful," said Rio, not changing his position. "It exists," went on Martin calmly. "It's part of life. It has its particular and its important position in the world. It has its stages and its stratas. Thus it is, Rio. This force was created." "Created for what?" demanded Rio. "For nightmares?" He wiped away the sweat from his forehead. "No," said Martin, "created for balance." "Balance, hell! Those upside-down bastards. I didn't say they were balanced. I don't know that, because I don't know where the average begins or ends. I said they were created for balance, a necessary people forming a resilient salient between the rigidity of the sexes." "I don't see it," said Rio heavily. "Don't bother then," said Martin, "and don't make an issue of it. I've looked at Carroll and seen the reason, the essential purpose of his destiny." "Go on," said Rio. "And I've looked at Drew," Martin continued. "He made me wonder what the word normal meant." "God, you're crazy," whispered Rio. "I've looked at Roberts," confessed Martin, "until his helpless, sick desire forced me into desperation, and I tasted the germ of his too bright mouth." "God," repeated Rio, horrified. "And I've looked at you," went on Martin. "Yeah," breathed Rio, straining forward, "and I became less blind." Rio's heavy shoe scraped the pavement. "And I've looked at myself," said Martin, lifting his voice, and still more firmly. "I've looked at all of us, and found us all so different, and yet so much the same." "Holy Christ!" said Rio softly. "Aye," Martin nodded. "Holy Christ." They left the park and walked on silently, each thinking more of the other's thoughts than of his own. A wind from the south, carrying a burned, sulphurous cloud, quickly hid the stars and descended until even the solitary street lamps were darkened, became ominous, and were worse than none at all. It muffled the occasional sounds of the late night, and was as forbidding as the attitude of these two silent men. For except themselves the streets were deserted, and their presence only accentuated the desolation. It was a moment of such stillness that even nature becomes disturbed and ultimately furious, and sharply moving her wing brings down a sudden and a violent sound. A block away from Martin's room an ambulance rushed past them, its siren full and piercing. It drew up quickly before the house, and an ambulance doctor with white cap and trousers bent over a man who was lying on the curb. A thin group of spectators had gathered. They were quiet, looking on curiously. Martin's landlady was standing by, shivering and crying. Martin went to her and touched her arm. "What is it, Mrs. O'Brien?" he asked. "I don't know, Mr. Devaud," sobbed the woman. "I heard a noise. I guess it was a shot. So I looked out the window, and there he was." Martin hurried back to Rio. "What does it look like?" he asked nervously. "I can't see." Rio struck a match. "I dunno. He can't get no pulse." The doctor was still kneeling between them and the figure. At last he moved to one side and opened the man's shirt, throwing a point of light on a small discoloured spot under the heart. The man's face was in bas-relief, but above the wound, in a broken curve, lay a delicate golden necklace. Martin leaned over swiftly and started to speak, but Rio stepped in front of him. "The guy's dead, eh, Doc?" he asked solicitously, glaring at Martin all the while over his shoulder. "Get back," said the doctor brusquely to the crowd. Then he called out to the driver, "Come on, Jim, lend a hand." Rio took Martin by the arm, and they walked up the steps quickly. "You goddamn fool," Rio kept whispering to him. "You goddamn fool, keep your goddamn mouth shut." In Martin's room they sat down and faced each other. Rio continued to swear at him. "So there you are," he said mockingly. "Carol's knocked off, and you want to butt in." "Oh, for Christ's sake, shut up," said Martin miserably. Then, seeing the expression on Rio's face, he went over to him and put his hand on his shoulder. "I didn't mean that, Rio. I know well enough you saved me a lot of trouble out there. I'm just trying to figure it out." "Don't be so dumb," said Rio, and put his cap on backwards. "Yes, it must have been Roberts. I suppose that's what he meant when he said he had proposed something. I knew it. I was slow. Damn him. Why?" "Why not? Carol was in his way," said Rio philosophically. Martin stood up. "Rio," he spoke swiftly. His voice was harsh, and a terrible light burned in his eyes. "Take it easy," Rio answered calmly. "He won't hurt Dean tonight. He's weak some ways. This one job's enough for his stomach this time. He's in bed, cracked up, puking his guts out. But later, I dunno." Rio was growing thoughtful. "How did he get away with this, Rio?" "He's a clever son of a bitch." "Clever?" repeated Martin. "I wonder." He moved toward the door. "Rio, I'm going to see him." Rio went to his friend and held his arm. "Don't stick your chin out, Martin," he said earnestly. "Maybe I got an idea myself." He righted his cap and without further explanation left the room. Martin pulled up the rocker in front of his small radio, which he turned on softly. There, his head in his hands, he sat and rocked until morning. Then he took a train uptown to Dean's. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of This Finer Shadow by Harlan C. McIntosh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Roberts woke up with a sticky feeling in his mouth. He felt his wrist. It was still throbbing. With difficulty he repressed a sudden panic brought about by his full consciousness of this last and most horrible link forged in the confused entries of his life. He got up, put his feet in a pair of slippers, and went to the mirror. He stuck out his tongue and looked at it carefully. Walking away, he stopped suddenly and glanced over his shoulder at himself. Then he rang for his breakfast and went into the bathroom. Although he was accustomed to this pale orient, an atmosphere of mauve with the suggestion of a darker tone, enhanced by lights direct and indirect, it seemed to stimulate him now as though it were a new experience. He took a crystal flagon from its glass shelf and shook the bottle slightly, watching the opalescent liquid as hungrily as though he were going to drink it. Removing the stopper, he closed his eyes and drew in a deep breath, shivering, and as an afterthought carefully shook 2 drops upon his fingers and rubbed them into his temples. The astonishing scent filled the bathroom, and Roberts leaned against the wall as the odor of stable frost arose about him. Slowly he removed his pajamas, white as his skin, and let them fall around his feet. The warm water from the shower sprayed off his head. He stuck out his tongue again and swallowed a little of the water. It tasted salty, and he spat out what was left. After a careless shave, he put on a dressing gown of deep red corded silk, and, staring vacantly, sat down in front of the coffee table in his living room. The boy knocked and entered with his breakfast. "My paper?" Roberts looked up inquiringly. "Yes, sir. It's on your tray, sir," answered the boy. "That's right, my lad. Always a paper with one's eggs." The adviser laughed sententiously. The boy put down the tray. "Will that be all, sir?" Roberts looked up again severely. "Is that all?" "Most certainly. Do I ever digress from this routine?" "No, sir," said the boy, and left. Roberts mused, his lips spasmodically making little ticking sounds. Is that all? What else could he want? The scamp! He acted as if he knew something. A pretty lot he could know, or anybody, for that matter. The adviser looked around the room, smiling shrewdly. There was a single scarlet geranium on his tray. He picked it up with a caress and held it briefly under his nose before he bore off the petals. Then he looked at his eggs. "Cold as usual," he said bitterly. "And what's this? A spot?" He put his spoon into the eggs. "The nucleus, no doubt. Good heavens, does fertilization confront me even in my breakfast?" He tried to control his anger and nibbled at a piece of bacon and toast. The hot black coffee he drank greedily. A short article at the bottom of the front page of his paper attracted his attention. He read through it swiftly. A murder in Greenwich Village. He smiled again, this time his right eye winking slightly. "Definitely a bad neighborhood, Mrs. Twitchett," he said amiably. "People who go down there must expect such things, my dear." Then with a start he brought himself up. "You ass!" he spoke harshly to himself. "You giggling impossible hermaphrodite! Hush!" But unable to repress his amusement, he laughed aloud, pressing his fingers to his lips secretively. After a while he picked up the paper again. What was the name? Carroll? Yes, Carroll Stevens. A young chap. So the paper says. But he'll be a long time down there. It will bring maturity. Unfortunately, he might be connected with Martin Devaud. That would be scandalous. Before the smile reappeared on Robert's face, he looked at the article once more. Certainly it would not involve himself, being merely decent to a homespun lad like that. There couldn't be any connection there. He spoke aloud again. "There isn't any connection, you bloated bunch of rags, you confounded greyish bunch of rags. This is the time of year to remain in one's own department." He went to the desk and took a sheet of paper. Meticulously he wrote, "To the police. Using a small caliber automatic and under the pretense of friendship, I approached and shot Carroll Stevens. The motive was jealousy. Signed, William Roberts." He permitted a slight smile. Then taking a box of matches out of his pocket, he struck one and lit a corner of the paper. After the note had burned, he dropped the ashes into the waste basket. He took another piece of paper and wrote the same message, stood up and looked at it from a distance, taking his eyes away from it at intervals, for a second at a time. Then he picked up the paper and, waving it around, walked to the other end of the room. After a few moments he walked back, humming, and slowly burned it too. Again he wrote the message. This time he left the room. A moment later his face appeared in the doorway. It was tense as he walked rapidly to the desk. But when he saw the message, undisturbed, he smiled again. He picked it up, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it across the room. Leaping after it and retrieving it with a desperate sweeping motion, he unrolled it with quivering fingers. Hastily he read the words, and again the satisfied smile lessened the tension on his face. Then he rolled the paper once more and walked to the inside wall. He stood with his back to the room for a long time, at last throwing the wadded note as far over his shoulder as he could, one hand covering his eyes. Turning around, he looked on the floor. The paper was not there. He began to walk back and forth swiftly, looking on the divan, on the chairs. The message was not to be seen. Finally he stopped in the center of the room, a curiously stupid expression on his face. He felt slightly dizzy, and the room seemed to be turning. He walked hesitatingly to a chair, his titubation increasing. Leaning over the chair, he looked at the room from this angle. The paper had apparently vanished. He felt his pulse and was alarmed by its rapid beat. In an attitude of half fear, half anger, he went hurriedly over the room again, lifting the pillows from the divan and from the chairs. Then he went to a mirror and looked at himself. The pupils of his eyes were large and startling, set in a pale greyish face lined with anxiety. Panic-stricken, he ran to his clothes closet and took down another dressing-robe. This he hung over the mirror in the living-room. Animal-like, he fell to his knees, and crawling around the floor, peered under the fringe of the rug. His shoulder bumped against a chair, and he tipped it over angrily. His movements became more and more frenzied. At last each article had been closely inspected, and still there was no message. He ran to the door and locked it securely. Suddenly he looked at the window. It was open. He drew his hand across his forehead, which was covered with perspiration. His knees trembled. He sat down abruptly, the upset furniture swaying around him. Within this desperate sense of fear he quickly regained his balance. He went to the buffet and drank a small brandy. Unsteadily but seriously he dressed. He started to leave the room, hesitated, and as an afterthought went to the window. He leaned out and looked down at the alley-like space between the buildings. Unable to distinguish anything, he closed the window, went out into the hall, and rang for the elevator. Downstairs he crossed the court, climbed over a low fence, and walked down the space under his window. One crumpled white paper drew his attention, but it was an empty cigarette package. Toward the sidewalk he saw another wadded paper. People were passing close by, and he picked it up self-consciously, not daring to hope that it was the one he wanted. Walking back to the court, he opened it feverishly. His eye caught the first line. It said, "To the police." He read no further, but jammed the note hastily, though carefully, into his pocket and folded his hand around it. In his apartment came the reaction. He lay on his back on the upset divan, his hand still gripped around the paper, and wept softly and bitterly. When he had stopped shaking, he went to the desk, smoothed out the paper, and read it, a definite horror on his face. Then anger relieved his fear, and he struck the note repeatedly with his fist. Throwing it into the metal waste-basket, he tossed burning matches after it until the confessional was alight with flames. Methodically he straightened the room and took the robe from the mirror. Looking into the glass he held at his hand and with amazing swiftness struck the side of his face. Later, in the bathroom, he saw with satisfaction the purple outline of his fingers on his cheek. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of This Finer Shadow by Harlan C. McIntosh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dean answered the telephone nervously. A voice, thin and unsteady, came over the wire. "Dean, this is Roberts." With difficulty, Dean restrained a sudden feeling of panic. The adviser spoke quickly without waiting for her acknowledgment. "This is rather unusual, but I assure you the situation is imperative enough to justify its obvious lack of convention." Dean's anxiety increased. "What situation, Roberts?" she asked. "A situation so delicate that its discussion by phone is impossible. Won't you do me the kindness to have dinner with me?" Robert's voice had taken on a strange, beseeching quality. Thoroughly frightened by the implication of drama, Dean tried to remember that she had once been attracted by his intelligence, amused at his suavity. She accepted his invitation. What could he want of her? She was glad that Martin had gone home. He would never let her meet Roberts if he knew. She recalled how frightfully upset Martin had been that morning. While she was dressing, she kept wondering what urgency had prompted the adviser to contact her so quickly after the tragedy. Surely no guilty man would do such a thing. Perhaps Martin and Rio were wrong. Perhaps Roberts wanted to help. Did he know about that picture of Martin the police had found in Carol's pocket? Thank God Martin had had an alibi. Or did alibis really count? Poor Carol, was she responsible for his death? It was true that she had introduced him into this ill-assorted group of men who, more experienced in the conflicting currents of human emotion, could anticipate and often avoid such danger. She remembered little phrases and gestures of Carol which in retrospect seemed touching and childlike. She remembered the day she had gone to lunch with him, his earnest, immature face as he reflected the thoughts and effusions of this man whom she was meeting. What blindness of hers that she had not foreseen an approximate outcome of this relationship. Dean's eyes were full of tears. She felt the tremendous sorrow of the immaculate woman for the spikes and chains which bind humanity's certified incompetence. Too, for herself, there were tears of indignation, resentment over being drawn into this formidable unity. She finished dressing and hurried uptown. In the restaurant, Roberts leaned slightly forward over the table, his hands together. "Dean," he said, "I didn't ask you to meet me because of Carol's tragedy. The child was drawn into a significantly dangerous vortex, but it is about this uncompromising whirlpool itself, which may engulf others whom I love, that I want to speak. There is something here, some sinister thing about us that is in deadly earnest. Do you sense it, Dean?" "Yes, Roberts, particularly now." "Martin," continued the adviser, "does not appreciate the undercurrent of this danger. It is for this reason, for this one reason, I begged you to see me." "Yes," Dean repeated, feeling her skin tighten as it does under a great and hopeless fear. "I've but one thought in mind," Roberts proceeded. "Martin's future. His temperament is one that will not adjust itself to the inevitable." Dean's hand closed over her bag. A swift feeling of revulsion changed as quickly to one of anger. "The inevitable?" she asked, controlling her voice. "Yes," said Roberts, "the inevitable routine of this world. I have it on good authority that he is about to lose his job at Miller's Typographical. You know his history. He came to me, a transient, a common seaman. I found him a good job. I made contacts for him in this respect, which he used, or rather abused, with an amazing recklessness. I do not understand his lack of appreciation, but these things are unimportant. Regardless of his inconsideration, I feel that there is definitely something worth saving." "That's good of you, Roberts," said Dean, inclining her head a little, the large hat shading her eyes. "Martin would be pleased to know that you consider his regeneration a possibility." Roberts' lips tightened at her irony. His fingers moved constantly over the white tablecloth, touching a cup, a spoon. "I appeal to you, Dean," he said finally. "I recognize your influence over him." She remained silent. "Have you no answer?" he asked. "Of course not." Dean's moist red lips closed tightly. Roberts picked up a spoon and tapped it nervously on the table. "I've always respected your antagonism, Dean, but I am somewhat unprepared just now to face a personal issue. By cooperating with me, I feel that we can bring about some satisfactory adjustment on the part of Martin that will give him success and happiness." The adviser waited, quiet and intent. Dean's eyes paled, the colour fading into clearness. She looked at Roberts abstractedly. To her it seemed that an unhealthy whiteness moved now under his skin. His handsome face seemed trembling, disintegrating, and forming anew, misshapen under the pressure of his mind. His cheeks appeared alive with white nerve roots, moving uncertainly like microscopic serpents. The lens of Dean's eyes penetrated through flesh into the dark coils of blood, visualizing curiously the spiraling, pallid germ. Roberts jerked in his chair. He leaned sideways, holding to the table. His cuff brushed a tumbler, and a little of the water spilled upon the cloth. "Dean," he spoke sharply, "what are you looking at?" Her eyes grew deeper, lost their transparency. "I was wondering." Robert's voice trembled. His words were insecure. "You were wondering? You were wondering at what? What are you looking at?" Dean took her eyes from him. "Please go on, Roberts." He hesitated. I was saying that you have a remarkable influence over Martin. Doubtless he has told you of our early misunderstanding, a misunderstanding based on the assumption that I was instrumental in having him fired. As an intelligent woman, you are probably aware of the fact that he lost his position because he neglected his work. He is not incompetent, but his social program affected his efficiency. Dean spoke without looking at him. "Do you mean that I caused Martin to lose his position?" Her lack of resentment, her cold, unemotional question, disconcerted the adviser momentarily. "Indeed not," he answered. "Please believe that I have valued and approved his friendships for certain people. Martin tends toward introspection and celibacy. It is most important that he cultivate the social quality. That is why I was so astonished that he should of a sudden become so interested in what constitutes society." "I do not constitute society, Roberts. I love him." Roberts lifted his eyebrows. "Dean," he said anxiously, "I hope that you do not believe that I have intended to invade your personal affairs. I'm concerned only with Martin's development. I truly desire his life to be a complete and happy one." "Then please tell me what you want." Dean made an uneasy little gesture. For one lost moment Robert's pallid cheeks were covered as though by the light of a beautiful dark flame, and he leaned across the table with a desperate, hopeless lust. "You know what I want, Dean. You've always known. Now he was breathless, and the colour left his face, leaving him whiter and more distraught than before. Dean sat erect. There was more than anger in her expression. There was the fury and the cruelty of all her sex against what she believed to be the pitiful, crippled shade of themselves, against the mist of a forever damned kinship which thought as woman thought, desired with woman's desire, and still was mist, without substance, without gratification. Dean's voice was barely audible. "Never," she whispered. At her expression and her exclamation, Roberts wet his lips, trembled slightly in his chair, gazing at her as though in some enchantment. "Never?" he asked, in a voice as low as her own, but with the quality of a protesting and bewildered child. Roberts, Dean spoke so sharply that he was shaken from his spell and sat more normally, looking at her now with quiet speculation. "What is it you wish me to do? I see no reason to protract a conversation so unpleasant." The adviser met her glance with restraint. "My motives are misconstrued," he said slowly. "You will forgive my naive desire to lend Martin my support." Again Dean's eyes dimmed and faded. Catching his own reflection, Robert's pallor grew even more deathlike. And again he gripped the table, his knuckles white under the transparent skin. In the opalescent mirror of the woman's eyes he saw his image, saw the pale movement within himself. Dean, her face cruel, drove her thoughts in swift waves, building and clarifying the image until the naked picture of the man and his disease rose clearly in her mind. There was an odour of decay. Roberts half rose from his chair, slipped back into it, and leaning sideways on the table, stared fixedly at her. Terrified, she arose. In Robert's face there was no blood, no expression. His eyes were set, and the cords of his throat made ridges in his white neck. Dean put her hands over her eyes. She knew now. Her thoughts raced. "He killed Carol. He wants to kill me." Without excusing herself, she left the restaurant and hurried to a cab. Roberts, his hands limp on the tablecloth, stared before him. He felt Dean's movement as she left, but he remained as he was. "Take your eyes, too," he said aloud. His voice rose higher. "I say, take your eyes." Other diners looked curiously at him, smiling and nodding their heads. A small, dark woman exchanged glances with her escort. "He's had plenty," she said. "I watched him and the woman. They had an argument. The man's tight." Her escort regarded Roberts earnestly. "I don't know. It looks as though he has the horrors." Roberts gazed steadily at the translucent eyes floating across the table. "All right, my dear. Stay there," he said loudly. The dark woman's escort glanced at him worriedly and beckoned to a waiter. "Say, waiter, there's a chap over there with the jitters. He needs looking after." The waiter approached Roberts warily. "Is there something you wish, sir?" he said deferentially. Roberts still watched the eyes. He stood up and spoke quietly. "Very well, I shall go. You remain here." Turning to the waiter, "My hat, quickly." Outside, the adviser hailed a taxi, climbed in unsteadily, and directed the driver to his apartment. Dropping his coat on the divan in the living room, he went hurriedly to the mirror and stared into it. The light on the glass wavered. A shadow appeared, and Dean's eyes, large and transparent, materialized before him. Roberts cried out sharply, "I told you to stay." He jerked around, went to a chair, sat on the edge of it, and put his head in his hands, rocking gently on his toes. "My God, Martin, to think that I could have loved you. After all, Devaud, you're nothing but a sailor, a hostile bestial." Robert's head jerked back, and he jumped to his feet, breathing heavily. "Dean," he panted, "you're in this room. It won't help to try and hide. I can locate you by your eyes. They are in that glass there." He pointed. "You think you know my secret. It's a lie. It's a dream, and you're a lie." He leaned against the chair, his cheeks darkening. "I'll find Martin. Martin will be fair. Martin, you always liked me. You didn't deserve a job. Take her away, Martin. I want to sleep. I can't sleep while she's hiding here." He stopped speaking, a crafty expression changing his face. Tiptoeing into the bathroom, he pulled the mirror from the cabinet, and holding it under his arm, crept back to the living room. Approaching the larger glass which hung at the end of the room, he quickly drew the other mirror from under his arm and held it so that the two of them reflected into each other. Then, bursting into short, sobbing laughter, he shook the smaller glass furiously. "There, look at yourself. You're sick, too." His laughter became fiercer until his body rocked from its violence. Suddenly he stiffened. The mirror dropped from his hands, the glass splintering, and Roberts fell. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of This Finer Shadow by Harlan C. McIntosh. Martin and Rio walked along the waterfront in silence. All activity seemed suspended. It was a lonely and a menacing panorama to both men who realized that the very heart of the city had been pierced. Imported goods and products for exportation were lying quiet, slowing up the commerce of the world. Union longshoremen and truckmen had walked out with the striking seamen, and the desperate efforts of independent groups could not compensate for the loss of regimentated teamwork and good fellowship so vital. Policemen patrolled each pier to prevent acts of violence between organized and unorganized labor. Between the entrances the scattered trucks rolled about like confused ants. "Damn the governors," said Rio, thrusting out his jaw. Who?" repeated Rio in exasperation. "Capital, you bastard, capital. You've eaten their sour pudding and slept on their lousy blankets, and you ask me who? It's capital that smashes labor." "Money and work," said Martin serenely. "Money and work." Rio turned on him nervously. "Cut out that speaking in tongues, or whatever the hell it is, Martin. I've heard you damn the companies from Shanghai to Point Said. Anyway, what about the printin' plant?" "It's closed. The boys walked out, that's all." "Why?" "The same reason they're walking out everywhere. For better hours, better conditions." "When do they open?" "I don't know. There'll be arbitration, of course. Most of the men, though, have put away enough chips to write it. I haven't." "Well," said Rio, "what are you going to do?" "I don't know that either. I've enough left to run me for a few weeks. Then if things haven't opened, I'll have to ship out." "And leave Dean with Roberts around? You told me not to mention her, but I guess it's okay now." "Dean will be all right," Martin nodded. "Roberts had a stroke. He can't move." "Roberts a stroke?" Rio looked pleased, and there was a definite satisfaction in his voice as he continued. "Maybe that's why my idea didn't work. I went to his place that night and the next. The second time he was home, but there was lights." Rio shook his head wisely. "And I work in the dark," he added, looking at Martin. "But about the plant, can't you get another job ashore?" "I doubt it. I don't know another trade." "Then what the hell good did college do you?" "College? That's another one I can't answer," said Martin. "I was too young. The world turned backwards. I hated my young, fresh hair and the child in my face. I needed the forest and the open sea, an insane wind that held my breath. I hated pedantry and the inquisitive eyes of girls." "What else?" asked Rio. "It's too old to hurt now," answered Martin. "Go on," said Rio. "It wasn't much. It taught me to drink incredibly bad gin, corrosive enough that it's a wonder I have any guts left." "Why, go on." "I know," said Rio. "You had it your way, and I had it mine. But it was all the same. I had the wind you longed for, and it put scissors in my throat. Let's forget it. Look." He pointed to a wharf near them, one group of men walking along it, held signs in the air. Another, grimly silent, stood by the entrance to the warehouse pier, watching those who came out and those who entered. "We'll forget our trouble in that scramble, Martin. It looks like our boys have tied up a ship." "Let's see, that's Pier V7. What ship's that?" "The Liana. She makes Pedro and Puget Sound, I think." One of the men who were carrying signs stopped when he saw them. "Howdy, Rio. Hello, Brick. What's the jibe?" "They paid us off and are trying to ship a Fink crew," answered the man, hitching the sign a little higher. "We dumped the mattresses over the side last night coming in. The bed bugs had made 'em snug harbor. I slept on the hatch all the coast of Mexico, and God, what roaches!" Said Rio, and he and Martin walked on. They had started uptown when a man came out of the warehouse. One of the union men who was watching the doorway ran after him and knocked off his cap with the flat of his hand. The other tried to fight back, but was smothered with punches before a policeman broke it up. "Like old times," said Martin. "Yeah, let's go up to the hall," suggested Rio. They reached South Ferry, walked to Pearl Street, and went up the stairs into an old building. The room was crowded with seamen. Some of them, in chairs tilted against the wall, were sitting quietly or exchanging stories. Others were playing cards. The air was full of tobacco smoke, stale and close. Rio and Martin went to the desk. A jumpy-eyed man behind it knew them and nodded. Martin took out his book. His dues were paid to the following month, but he laid down $8 more. The nervous fellow looked at him, then took the book and examined it carefully. "I see you ain't got in no picket duty since you left the West Coast," he said. "No. We could use a man on the line tonight." "I'll be there." "Put me down too," said Rio. "I need a good sleep." "Yeah," snapped the agent. "This ain't Frisco nor Portland, where they bat their scabby brains out. Here the company takes these Fink bastards from the ship by car and leaves 'em in town. The boys make a few clap joints, meet the transportation, and are brought back to the ship." The agent licked his lips, showing perfect teeth, shining and yellow. "It's silk till they sail under." He bit a fingernail and turned to another man. Rio was growling when he and Martin left the hall. "God damn the Finks," he said. "That's right," agreed Martin. "They struck me midships once. They nearly sank me." "You know," said Rio angrily, "I like you, but for Christ's sake don't give me your end of the sea. You're about as salty as lard." Martin smiled. "Yes, they nearly sank me," he repeated. "The ship was listing 14 degrees when the boatswain ran into the forecastle in his dirty underwear. He danced the Isidori with a bottle of sake under one arm and an ordinary seaman under the other, on a deck that would have frozen grandmother's mittens. Now, Rio, do you figure yourself a deep-water sailor because you've pulled in the log on a cold night and lashed barrels to a hatch with your butt to the wind? Are you sure of the ocean? Have you ever curled a sea egg around your elbow, kissed a barracuda over black water, raced a shark in a harbor full of battle wagons, dumping garbage with your own boat 40 feet away against the wind? Have you winked at a sea spider and made him shuffle backwards till his legs ruffled slow as sand in your face?" "Well," said Rio, laughing, "I told you once you were the part of—" They were back at Pier V7. Other men were concentrating from the hall to relieve the day pickets. They brought in 2 cars full, said a tall fellow who had been heading the day men. He turned to Rio. "You take care of the night gang. We'll bring down coffee. The company is using black sedans. Some of the blinds was down when they pulled in. A couple of cops is standing by the gates, so you can't do much there. But if you divide your gang and send half of 'em up the alley a ways, you can get a sign. Hop on the running board, and you know what to do. Another thing, all the deck officers walked out when we was paid off except the 3rd mate. That's one company man I'd like to see you get. The Finks may not get no leave tonight, but the Leanna don't sail for 4 days. If we keep a good lookout, maybe we can get a couple of the bastards. That's all, except don't do no drinking." "What's that on your breath?" asked someone. "Orange juice." "I can hold it," said the tall fellow. The pickets laughed and the daymen left. The night gang joined around Rio. "I'll take a few of you up there." Rio pointed to a pile of dunnage. "The rest of you watch the gate. If a company car comes, give me a light 3 times and get out. We'll take care of the rest of it. Don't talk to the cops unless they talk to you first. Keep your distance from the gate. Have you got a torch you can signal me with, Billy?" "No, I ain't. I got mine here," said one of the men, pulling out a flashlight. "Give it to Billy," said Rio. "He's worked with me before. Remember, Billy, burn it at me 3 times." "Okay." It was almost dark, and Rio selected his men, including Martin. They walked up the street to an old pile of lumber by a dark pier. "Get this, boys, no knives. A club's best, but not a piece of pipe. Work on 'em hard, but don't kill 'em. You, Eddie, and you, Martin, and me'll hop the running board, smash the glass, and bring her to the side. We got to work fast before Brass Buttons shows up." "What if they're company officials?" asked Martin. "They won't be here," said Rio, amused. "But if they are, give 'em 2 instead of 1. "What's the matter with ye, sonny?" asked a dwarf-like man with immense shoulders. "Is your belly soft?" He glared at Martin. "We'll find out soon, my muscle-bound patriot," said Martin, walking toward him swiftly. Several seamen jumped between them. "I'll hear one more crack from either of you, and I'll bat your thick skulls together," said Rio quietly. "Our union is split already. We got work to do, and you start a parade. You ain't fit to work." "I'll work," said Martin. "Me too," said the heavy seaman. "Shake hands," said an older man with grizzled hair and intense, strained face. "It was my fault," said Martin. "Naw, it was mine," objected the squat fellow sheepishly, as they shook hands. "You don't need to kiss," said Rio sharply. Then he held up his hand. "Get this straight," he continued. "It ain't no joke we're playin'. Maybe this'll help." He took a bottle from his pocket and passed it around, each man taking a shot of the liquor. Rio finished it and tossed the bottle under the dunnage. "It's about time for the rats to come out if they're goin' ashore," he went on. "Keep an eye to the pier." He turned suddenly to one of the younger seamen. "You ain't got no club." "My brother was killed in Detroit that way, Rio. Lemme use my fists." Rio turned his face aside for a moment. When he looked at the boy again, it was like metal. "Get yourself a club, buddy." Hesitatingly, the seaman took up a knotty piece of wood. He held it in his hands one way and then another, his face white. One of the men came up to Rio and took him to one side. He said something in a low voice, and Rio nodded. The man returned his nod and left hurriedly. "This is the time, dear mother," hummed a seaman. "Shut up," said his partner. They waited silently, watching the pier for any light. Suddenly a man came upon them, startling them as he shuffled in and laid down a large package. "Here it is, Rio," the man was panting. "It's me, Al." "Beer," the men exulted, quietly peering through the early darkness. Al now took a short automatic from his pocket and handed it to Rio. "Drink up," Rio said to the men. Each man took a bottle and waited in turn for the opener, except one seaman who, impatient, knocked off the cap of his bottle against a block of wood. "Take the rest down to the men at the pier," said Rio to Al, who shambled away noiselessly. Someone struck a match. In the flare Rio saw Martin regarding him steadily. He grinned. It was a painful, smashing look, and he didn't take his eyes away. The match flickered out, and Martin came up to him slowly. "Watch for the lights, Eddie," cautioned Rio, as he and Martin walked a few yards away from the lowered sounds of the men. "So you believe, Martin, that I'd pull this?" Rio twisted the automatic in his hand. "Al got this for me. He'd eat out of my hand. Never mind why. This belongs to Roberts. It was used one night. I got it for you." "You told the story?" asked Martin. "I told no story. Al's a thief. He does what I say, but his heart is finer than yours." "I don't doubt it," said Martin, feeling the gun and Rio's hands in the dark. Breaking it under Rio's wrist, he suddenly threw back his arm and spun the automatic into the river. Vaguely he heard Rio say there were lights. Martin looked toward the pier and saw the headlights of an automobile coming upon them. The car was gaining speed as it passed the pile of lumber. Martin, faster than the others, leaped for the running board and swung himself against the windshield glass, holding to the door handle. His head was turned just enough to see Eddie jump behind him. Eddie missed the board. His body spun vertically against the rear fender and crashed on the pavement. Behind him, Rio was running frantically. Martin smashed his hand through the side window, feeling slivers of glass against his arm. He caught the driver by the throat, and through the sound of the motor could hear the dark gurgle under his fingers. There was swearing and shoving inside, but Martin hurt too much to care. He pushed steadily against the lower part of the wheel until the machine swerved and tilted toward the river. It came around in a wide arc, breaking heavily on the shoulder of the pier. Then Martin heard Rio's voice and knew that he himself was falling. He turned so that the back of his head would not strike the paving, and felt the rush of hot blood as his nose and mouth hit first. Instead of putting him out, it cleared his brain. He lay quietly, watching Rio swing his fist and then his club. Abstractly he watched the other men in the crew go into action against the Finks. He didn't care. The gorilla-like sailor with whom he had quarrelled held a bottle as though it were a club. He was snarling as he pulled a man from the car. "So it is ye finkified mate. I've been looking for ye," Martin heard him say. "I've been looking for ye and your damn long finger. Ye've pointed at me like a dog. God, I'll get that finger now," he added hoarsely, bringing the bottle down on the fender of the car until it was split across. Savagely he threw the mate on the ground, held him by the collar and stepped on his wrist. Then, separating the man's forefinger from the rest of his hand, he brought down the split edge of the bottle sharply above the middle knuckle. "Wife, wife," cried the mate softly. The seaman picked up the severed finger, shook it in the man's face, and flung it on the ground beside him. "Splice it, Jack, splice it," he was cursing the fallen man brokenly. Martin looked away. Then he saw the boy whose brother had been killed in Detroit. Automobiles, thought Martin. The boy had no club and was on his back, fighting desperately with the large man from the car. Martin crawled to his knees, not feeling his injured arm or his split chin. He stood waveringly for a moment and got to them just as the man's broad hand was spearing the boy's face. Martin knew that he was falling again, not fighting as he reached them, but he dug his teeth into a fleshy neck and held on as though he were killing a snake, while the body beneath him thrashed and cried. A hard hand pulled him off. Rio was standing above him. "It's over, Martin. We got a car. Come, men." Martin spat out blood and climbed into the automobile along with the others. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of This Finer Shadow by Harlan C. McIntosh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Martin went slowly to Robert's apartment house, his head lowered. His right arm was in a sling. The lower part of his mouth was bruised and split. His nose was swollen. He went up in the elevator to Robert's rooms and rang once. A doctor came out into the hall. For a moment the two men regarded each other speculatively. Martin saw the blue, introspective eyes, the strong turn of the chin, and the gray hairline receding deeply at the temples. The physician saw a young man with a broken, elusive face. "I'm Martin Devaud, doctor. I'm Robert's friend. I heard he asked for me." "I can see you, Martin," said the physician kindly, "for I'm Robert's friend, too." Martin rubbed his cut arm and turned his eyes away. "You can see? How far?" The physician shook his head, but did not answer. "This stroke," Martin continued, "is it serious? Is there any time to help?" All this while the doctor had been watching him, noticing his bruised face and strained expression, his bandaged arm. "You seem to have been in something of a mix-up yourself," the physician smiled faintly. Then of a sudden his face became divisible with the old tired pains and the new sharp ones as balance. "Do you know Robert's condition?" he asked seriously. "No," said Martin. "Roberts and I quarrelled, and I haven't seen him lately." He ran his hand over his tender chin. The doctor looked off down the hall, and in his eyes there was now restraint born of his intimacy with pain. "He mentions your name continually, Martin," observed the physician. "The thought of you seems to make him desperate in the moments of lucidity which unfortunately attend his madness. And from the strange way he talks at times, one might think you had had a part in the cause of this grave illness. But such is not the case. His illness took root years ago." One word cried out to Martin. "Madness, you say?" "Yes," said the physician. "It's like the putrefaction of albumin, almost like the expansion of gases within a closed chamber. This disintegration must go on. It's what we have here." Martin felt himself turning sick. "Putrefaction, doctor?" "Yes, putrefaction of the cerebral mass, that most delicate and most amazing structure, a powerful gift to man." The doctor was grave. "What can I do?" asked Martin, horrified. In answer, the physician shook his head, and Martin knew that all was futile. "May I see him?" Again the doctor regarded Martin thoughtfully. It was as though he wondered whether this man's agitated mind could view the spectacle which was soon to be presented, and Martin, waiting quietly, understood and respected this professional skepticism. At last the physician spoke. "Before you go in, Martin, remember that you are looking at the demanding, expansive form of paresis. Be careful." As Martin entered the bedroom, he saw a disoriented face, a deflective rapport of Roberts with his environment, a clouding of consciousness, and as he went closer he knew that Roberts had no comprehension of detail or of situation. Martin felt completely helpless. It seemed to him that the translucent, attenuated skeleton of the adviser had wrapped its arms around him instead of the disease. The sick man's lips, dry and split, opened and closed in an effort to speak. The guttural tones reached Martin's ears as though from a great distance, the words moving gently like a broad leaf without wind. "Martin, Martin!" Robert's expression became clear and defined. The immobile muscles of his face relaxed. "Martin," he repeated, "are you there?" In the room was a terrible pressure. Again he called, "Martin, Martin, are you there?" "Yes, Roberts, I'm here." The pitiful, decayed mask upon the pillow broke like a free tide. It spilled in diluted, semi-conscious tears against the linen. Roberts tried to shake the covers, but his hands stood out perpendicularly from the sides of his waist. They remained there, insensitive, incoherent, until Martin took them gently and laid them on the sheet. Again momentary consciousness lighted Robert's face. Its brightness and shrewd study shocked Martin more than any act of tension could have done. "Do you want a confession, dear boy?" called out the sick man. "Do you want my signature? Ha, ha! Ho, ho, he! The ghastly cry reflected from the ceiling. It wasn't laughter or hysteria. It was a lachrymose and untidily folded cry of remorse, torn from the swiftly hollowing brain cell. With his left hand Martin raised his own wounded arm to his forehead. When at last he brought it down, the gauze was wet. In the interim, bright eyes shone through the window. They were mirthful, smouldering, and amused, the cancerous eyes of birds. Infuriated, Martin crossed the room and pulled down the blinds. When he turned in the direction of the bed once more, Robert's luminous eyes were parallel with his hand, which was now hanging over the edge of the covers. The constriction of the pupils was so intense, so minute that the eyes seemed blind, but the expression was one of gravest interest. "Come, Martin, come, infidelity, you're my only one. If I don't look grotesque enough for a death scene, give me a nightcap, one with white flaps over the ears and a blue peak. Laugh for me, Martin. For God's sake, Roberts, not now. I'm dying with you." There was a sprawling, unintelligible sound from the adviser's lips, and then silence. Martin waited, amazed at the clarity of Robert's words, amazed at this strange and powerful mind, still formidable. Again the adviser looked at him. "Die?" he asked peevishly, then more firmly. "No, you won't, darling. Unhappy men don't die. Could you give me your strong brown arm without shuddering? It would mean a great deal to me. I can see your strong brown arm, where there's heat and dark, flashing clouds. It's peeling a tangerine, cutting a fruit for lips as soft as the flesh in my spine. Oh, wicked, a dark girl's belly. The cup for your mouth. Oh, God, Martin, your mouth, the stomach, the stench of normalcy. Before that happens, give me your arm, your clean brown arm." Martin went swiftly to the bed, his eyes flickering as he sank to his knees. With his good left arm, and hiding the one stripped with bandages, he lifted the skull-like head until it was level with his own, which had begun to throb and ache. "Here is my arm, Roberts. It is your protection and your faith," he said. Vapidly Roberts smiled at him. "My faith, my own true faith. No one believed, but I knew that you were mine. Not even Dean believed." "Not even Dean," repeated Martin, his wounded arm shaking against the silken counterpane. Robert's eyes were becoming glazed. They'd all feel cheap if they could see us now. Your arms around a corpse that strikes to prove itself. His thin hand pushed against Martin's broken nose, falling again and again on Martin's face, which failed to recognize the pain. You love me, though. I'm defeated, my dear boy. He raised his hand once more, but this time it dropped limply to the coverlet. Again the torn brain lost all contact, and he wandered hesitantly. I come before the leisured policies of man. I have these tears, these positive notes of cruelty. Do you want to know? Smash the hidden casket of Carol, and you'll find the first. He fed himself with the intolerable dreams of your isolated sanctuary. He cried out of lips as stale as mine. Our grail was the same, each futile in its own pride. Carol the bucket, filled with the residue of my hatred. Murder, death, that's nothing. I went to him on a night grey as your eyes. He desired you. His flesh quite frantically cried out. Could I stand that? Could I stand the cornered stupidity of his mind after you, most beautiful? I went to him. Deadly and most honestly, I threw the passionate leaden stone into the vacuum of his heart. Robert spoke without lips, the ventriloquy of his despair so hurtful and adolescent, so pitifully gay. There's a tear for Rio. I've seen him follow you with his eyes. That rollicking, healthy sailor, that bold adventurer with the mongoloid eyes. His bravado is covered with a native strength to hide his shame. Roberts chuckled hoarsely. My sinful innocent, never to have seen the colored lechery behind his muscles. Rio, epitome of flesh, carnality in Mother Goose's shoes, a bundle of white snow. Quite terrified, I've seen his bleak face whipped by the wind and wave, and so have you. But it takes death to bring me the knowledge of his simple, frightened passion. Oh, he will never fail you, though he doesn't know why. Enough of him, enough of his cautious, boastful gallantry, which makes one sick when one is well, and makes one laugh when one is sick. Again the adviser hesitated. Slowly and painfully he turned that he might look at Martin. The next tear is for Dean, the one you think you own. You don't possess her. You hold an empty vase, the artificial movements, smiles, and anguish of the woman, all of them as brazen as I, when I first met you. I thought you were the spindle, I the thread. I thought that you were life, an intoxicating bubble in a heavily filled glass. Deeply and amusedly I drank too late to feel the poison. I've saved a tear for Drew. He thought that he was strong enough to escape, but it isn't escape to avoid the thing one loves the most. And so I know I had the strength not to escape, and I am happier than he. The last tear is in a vial that I give you, a tear to use when abstract sorrow's not enough, a potion you may pour on blistered flesh to lift the crust of tender skin that each swift-moving piston and fast-spinning wheel of man can drive and curve before your fond excitement. On myself you didn't use a tear. Your hands and mine tore my integument until the bone shows. Watch this. Robert's weakened but fierce reached for Martin's hair. There was a brief silence as Martin, his head bowed over the bed, felt a momentary spasm of twisted fingers on his scalp. He did not speak or lift his eyes. As in a dream, he felt the fingers that had clutched his hair so frightfully become more feeble. There was a gentle, automatic patting against his forehead, and he heard deep, horrible sobs. Roberts put his hands across his eyes. Martin, you are like my desperate dead mother, she being the more selfish and adored, though, of the two. It's why I've loved you both, though you the less. She is the most important now. She is the greater. The adviser raised his head in a final gesture of triumph. Speak, why don't you speak, Martin? Your tongue's been loose enough before, but now that each mad syllable could match the inarticulation of my own vast lungs, you sit dumbly, like a passive Christ. Have you reformed, or are you a dead man waiting for my company? For I'm a king. I have great powers. Shall I have you tortured in my dungeons, or thrown from my domain? But no, I have no rack, no bed of agony to meet your own inventions, and my domain's a joke. You own it all, from the boiling centre of the earth unto the farthest, coldest star. Martin held him closer. He stared at Roberts until the sick man's eyelids lifted, showing the brief, unfocused glance. There was recognition, but complete indifference. The vacant, polite smile was only a slight movement of the lips. Had Martin not been blinded by his own fine helplessness, his deepened affection, he would have seen another thing. He would have noticed the oddly rounded chin with its slackness, its hint of cogent lechery below the hungry bones that stretched the cheek of the adviser. He would have seen the newly tapered lines out of silhouette, and the dense eyes gaping, or the fibrous hair, the cocked head and gently fluttering tongue. Instead, the generalities, vague outlines were predominant. This swiftly perishing mass, to Martin's eyes, could have been a sallow apple, a melon broken from the vine, or an older moon in autumn. There was no individuality or ego. There were damp breathings, sonorous emanations from the bed, and the faint orgiastic music of white flowers in a tomb. Martin held his breath, held his own head lower, and asked for some release. When he looked up again, the splendid spectral motion was gone forever. This mixture of sound and color, so horrible to him, now drifted from the gently closing door. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of This Finer Shadow by Harlan C. McIntosh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Martin knew that it was time to work again. He knew that there must be some expression of his own to erase the unending march of Carroll and Roberts in his thoughts. The evolution of his type design had stopped, each pattern seeming worse than the preceding one. He was disturbed and hesitant upon regarding the sun. The clouds were no longer poems, and the sunset meant only darkness. Within himself alone could he feel the yearnings and the beauty, the life cord pulling, insisting. He was tormented with dreams. Sounds grew from the ground. Proud women with dragons on their white shoulders walked in a death-like mist. Behind the retreating curve of mountain he could hear Dean laughing. Brought with the wind, the laughter became monotonous, something at which to strike. In the early morning there was peace. In the early morning, when even the birds were silent and the stars white, Martin would awaken and stand by the window. During these moments he was elated and alive, but when he went to sleep again he fought among dreams that seemed both real and unreal. One daybreak he awoke and threw his arms across his eyes. The night's monsters were growing larger and more demanding. Perhaps it was impossible to kill them by bending them into symbols, by throwing them on paper. The units of the living and the dead must be presented to daytime and the mind's curiosity. He worked soberly, breeding the straight line with the afflicted. He tried the medium of words, changing every character, crossing their susceptible hands. He danced the ugly noises with the sound of roses, and blew a splintering rock into a wreath of silver hair. Bravely he went to the night's agony and blinding sweat, until he felt himself confused by so meaningless a gallantry that once again he turned to Dean. They sat beside each other in her home that night. Dean saw that he had changed. She saw his quietude, the patient line between his eyes. He kissed her lips. "It's restful here, darling," he said, "a sweet domestic anodyne, the sweetest I've ever known. The transition has been swift. I ran with wild men, smashed machines, climbed, waited, and struggled toward an impossible ideal. I was hard when Kira was murdered, and though little chips were broken from me, the planets remained in their orbits. Heat meant one thing and cold another. This is still true in one sense, but my relationship to them has changed. Roberts died in my arms. He thought I loved him. Diseased, humiliated by our artificial sexual codes, he made his own world. Quite happily he lived and dreamed in this chimerical condition until, unfortunately, I entered his last kingdom. It had to be myself, the one man whose bitter defences remained impregnable to Robert's bold demands. However, as the albinic antagonistic germ bored into his brain, this mind became detached, severed, and I felt the pent-up hatred of his frustration. I didn't mind that, but suddenly consciousness was established again through some strange medium, and he told me it was my world, that he belonged to me. He told me of my cruelty, and that's how he died. I love you, Dean, but I'll go back to the mid-strip of the world where my toes bubble, oiling the hot deck of a ship, before I'll hurt you. That's my country, isolation in body but not in mind. And when I touch land it will be a dark horror. Martin's face had not changed expression, nor had his voice gathered volume, but his self-contempt and his visualizations against the soft purple shadows of the quiet room and the chained refractions of the woman's beautiful face beside him pressed heaven and hell together, and there was no breath around them. Dean held back her tears. "You're bleeding yourself, Martin," she said, "and for no reason. I'm in love with you, too, and I love your fantasies, but please don't talk of things which are absurd, of the South Seas, of dirty ships and dirtier islands. Your sound effects about black women are not dramatic, darling. They are just a little irrational. Oh, no, Martin, I'm not trusting your libido or your discrimination. To be candid, it isn't a question of trust. You must have your stage, your setting, and your actors. I don't mind that, and I'll be a part of the whole scheme, although I don't understand it. I've run wild too, though in a different way, but I found out how meaningless it was, how much it hurt me without helping anyone else, and I've stopped just as you'll do. There will always be violence in your dreams, and that will be some outlet, and there are gymnasiums and little fishing boats where you can break your neck in a more restrained fashion." Dean closed her hands on his and spoke with a desperate gravity. "And you can always swear loudly to me about the world's tyranny. Perhaps I'll swear a little also. But you can't go back to bad ships and worse men and be part of an organized brutality. I want you here with me. I want you to work on your beautiful ideas and build a solid foundation for both of us." "You look different, Martin. You look more mature. I think you're tired of that other world. Dearest," she went on, touching her lips to his cheek, "we can't dismiss our life together, even though it has been brief." She turned to Martin with a sudden, passionate insistence. "Let's go on from this point together, darling. Let's dismiss philosophy, ideals that can be forgotten in a night, other people's helplessness and drama." She held Martin more tightly. "We must stop thinking about these terrible people," she repeated. "What do we care about them?" Dean's lips trembled. "Carnality," she exclaimed, "the vile, damnable beasts, pouncing from house to house and bedroom to bedroom like a disjointed Roman carnival. Give them any veil of understanding you possess, and they still exist in the flat lands, the tilted, undernoted lowlands where not even slime comes to birth. A driveling code of introduction from one land to the other, and a rotten horde of young America comes alive. What have we to do with that?" Dean was weeping, and as though symbolical of her blazing words, her hair had spread over her shoulders, had spread, thought Martin as he touched it, like the flame of a torch in the dark waters of a lost lagoon. "What have we to do with that?" he repeated. "Nothing, Dean. Nothing can touch us now, but first I have to go from you. I don't know for how long or how far. It's part of the scheme. And remember, I didn't build it, but I know the undertows, the ebb tides and the breakers. There is a distant sun on our horizon, and I won't go into happiness or unhappiness until it's reached. Don't you think I'll miss those lights?" He pointed out of the window. "But I'll have stars around that will bring this room to me. I'm a dreamer, and they have luck. So forget the dull months or the aching ones. Give my picture a bath once a day until it's white, and I'll stay that way." Martin's voice broke, and he stood up. "I can't say good-bye, Mrs. Smith, and bow and strain until my sharp black coat sticks out, nor turn and smile. It's been a pleasant afternoon. I'll call you soon." His voice became harsh. "These fools' farewells and wet good-byes are as thick and viscous as a glue-pot, Dean. Sentiment rises in me easily, and I'm ashamed that my hand seems blurred against the dress that covers your knee. That's why I curse such weakness and yearn to leave my beloved with my hat over my nose, yelling blasphemously at a wall-eyed, pot-bellied moon." "You sound like a drunken Irish tenor," exclaimed Dean, covering her celibate pain at once with the same quick irony. "By God, I am drunk," cried Martin. "Drunk on your hair and the moisture of your lips and the way you look at me. Drunk with hatred because I won't see them or taste them again until the same dark wind that takes me away brings me back." A wraith-like smile hovered on Dean's lips. The wind that brings you home, Martin, won't be dark. It will be light and gentle, and perhaps will carry a few white clouds on its back. No, he shook his head. I want it dark and heavy and raging. I want it so fierce it will bring me home much faster. Let me have it my way, Martin, she urged softly. I want it gentle so that no part of you will be hurt. I've never been patient about most things, but I will be about this. Dean spoke so tenderly that the cool night wind stopped blowing, and a moment of such stillness ensued that all outside was hidden, all sound, all ways of sound and color, everything was hidden. Almighty God, whispered Martin, staring at her coral cheeks and swollen bosom. The Scylla deeps, a sea no man has found. Aloud he cried, it will be done your way, Dean. In the end it will always be your way. The tears were coming into his eyes without restraint. He opened the door, saw the silhouette of the woman sitting quietly on the couch, looked for a moment through the window at the lights which seemed to be nodding to him, and went into the hall. Outside in the street he hesitated, then turned toward the river. For a long time he wandered about the waterfront. Wearily at last he sat down on one of the piers and watched the moon set. When dawn came, he got up stiffly and went to the Seamen's Institute. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of This Finer Shadow by Harlan C. McIntosh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Martin went into the large main room of the Institute, found a vacant chair, sat down, and looked at the men. He couldn't recognize a single face, although the seamen were going through the usual formulas. Some of them were lined up before the marble bar, drinking coffee and eating doughnuts. Others stood in groups talking to each other, while a few, like himself, sat quietly, knowing themselves on the fringe of the stream. Some of these few were regarding their history, pressing their falls and errors out of the past. Some were rubbing the small change in their pockets, wondering whether to buy smoke and for a brief period drift into the senseless drunkenness and blindness of the poison, or to try again, to use this precious remnant of their money for getting to a pier already lined with men as desperate to ship out as themselves. A man walked in, brown-skinned, alert. He went in turn to several groups of seamen. They welcomed him, and he shook their hands. I wonder how long he'll last, thought Martin. A week, I guess, if he's paid off. He heard the men question the newcomer about the ship, the food. Had he seen Ella in Coconut Grove? Was Charlie's punch bowl as alive as ever? Had he paid off? The man grinned when they mentioned Ella, nodded his head vigorously about Jamaica, but said no about paying off. I can't get that way again, boys. He pointed to a few dead heads snoring in their chairs. His finger swung to Martin. For Christ's sake, he said, walking rapidly to him. For a moment he stood in front of him, shaking his head, his hands on his hips. You look like one of them crawlers we used to swat in Morocco. Is your short arm jammed? Martin managed a thin smile. I've spent a winter in New York, that's all. The sailor bent over him. Listen, I've been up at the hall. I heard what you done the other night. There's 2 ships in you can make. One is your old pal, the Verda. We need 2 men. Can you get Rio? I still got his oilskins. What happened to the little Ordinary, Al? Martin asked. The sailor looked puzzled. The Ordinary? Al thought a moment. Oh, you mean that little screw that was aboard when you and Rio piled off? Damned if I know. He only made one more trip. Say, he said, looking at Martin queerly, we sail at 5. There ain't no time to lose. Get hold of Rio and beat it to the hall. All right, said Martin, getting up. He went out quickly, nodding to the policeman by the entrance, then hurried to Rio's room and knocked on the door. Rio opened it. He looked half asleep. What's up? He asked, rolling back on the bed. James don't bring coffee till 11. I'm shipping on the Verda this evening. Do you want to come along? Nuts again, eh? Said Rio, yawning. Martin turned to go. Wait a minute, called Rio, sitting up. How do you know we can make her? We're the fair-haired boys after the other night. Al told me about the ship, but we have to hurry." "Are you leaving Dean?" asked Rio incredulously. "Don't ask me that," said Martin, his face turning white. "But I don't want the damned Verta. I'm going to Santa de Marina." "Rio," Martin opened the door, "this is the last trip we can ever make together. I don't want the Verta either, but she'll get me to Panama. From there I can make it to the East Indies, and as far as Santa de Marina is concerned, the Verta goes to Puerto Colombia. You can swim from that point." Without a word, Rio got up and began to put on his clothes. His bag was packed, and Martin didn't ask him why. When he was dressed, they went to the hall and saw the agent again. This time he greeted them more cordially. "I was hoping you boys would come. That was great stuff," he said, looking significantly at the end of his own nose. "You earned this jelly." He made out 2 forms for the mate of the Verta and gave them to Martin and Rio. "Get there by 3 p.m., drunk or sober." One of his eyes twitched nervously. "Okay," said Rio. He and Martin put their slips in their pockets and left the hall. "Is your gear ready, Martin?" "It won't take long, but I have a note to write, so we'll make it fast." Once in his room, Martin packed his clothes with Rio's help, saw that his sneakers were rotten, and threw them away. Then he sat down at his desk, folded his drawings, and put them in an envelope addressed Mrs. Idara. For a few moments he sat there staring at the name, a shameless grief upon his face. After a little he took a piece of paper and pen and wrote, "Dearest." Rio walked up and down, smoking one cigarette after another, stopping at intervals to glance somewhat anxiously at Martin. When Martin finally got up, his eyes were red, but he looked straight at Rio. "That's that, my bonny friend. We're going to the Verta." On the deck of the Verta they found the mate. He looked at the papers sent from the hall and at the men's discharges and lifeboat tickets. "You can take the 8 to 12, Martin, and you, Rio, the 4 to 8. The boatswain won't mind. He's sleeping some of it off. We sail at 5, and if you go ashore, for God's sake, don't get too drunk. Somebody has to handle those derricks. Al and Pete's ashore, and the ordinaries came from Mr. Fizz in the office. They won't know a block from a winch." "I'm not going ashore," said Martin. "Me neither," said Rio. The mate looked at them in some astonishment as they went aft. Then he shook his head. It was like all ships at sailing time. The sailors cursed the lines, and the mates cursed the sailors. The ordinaries didn't know what to do, but they hopped gallantly from one side of the deck to the other in a cold sweat of pretense. Pete's arm was nearly pulled from its socket when Al gave the winch too much steam. A linesman on the dock shook his fist at the ship, and the captain walked up and down the bridge, saying little but looking at his watch frequently. A longshoreman got his finger caught working at one end of the hatch and yelled frantically in Italian, but finally it was done, as it is always, and the Verta backed into the current with the tugboat pushing against an impossible weight and barking angrily through her whistle. It was almost 8 when the last hatch had been battened and the lines coiled. Martin went back to the forecastle and washed his hands and face. Then he rubbed his back and chest, put on a clean shirt, and was on the ladder to the bridge in time to hear 8 bells struck. Martin grew into the relativity of time. Was it a day, a month, a year that he had been in these warm waters? The stars grew deeper in the night. The constellations spread their tails above the ship. The moon, more arrogant than ever, called from the sky and filled his eyes with dust. It was the same. The dark, fast knife of cloud that ran at him was welcomed as a friend. This monster might blot out in mercy the silhouette of Dean. When pressure, rain, and cracked dry lightning burned his eyes, he held his hands, his arms into the wind, that it might bring him solitude from dreams. And when the squall had passed, he turned to Rio. That entity was beautiful and clean. It swept out all the clammy, dirty things. You see that cloud? He pointed to the swift retreating sky. It had more tears in one brief moment, Rio, than both you and I and all our comrades in a lifetime. And once again, when life is sticky, seminent with lies, we'll find a ship and find that cloud and hold it. Rio sighed. End of chapter 30. End of This Finer Shadow by Harlan C. McIntosh.